Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to this Plan Talk, an event created by influential and inspiring women to benefit girls all over the world. Tonight, we're thrilled to be joined by Jude Kelly, Artistic Director of the Southbank Centre. We'd like to start with you telling us about your story. What is your story, the backstory to Jude Kelly?
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I grew up in Liverpool. I'm one of 4 daughters, and my father is one of 10 children. I think there is a direct relationship, which I am so lucky to have, between the way that my father experienced his life and therefore what he and my mother, which I'll come on to in a minute, felt they should have for their daughters, since, you know, you talked about your children. Very quickly, you know, father one of 10 from an Irish Catholic family, my mother one of 3 from a German Protestant second-generation family. The key thing that happened to my father was education. He won a scholarship. He was the youngest in his family of 10. He won a scholarship. So he automatically began to feel that his world would be bigger. My father, and then marrying my mother, which was a sort of mixed marriage in Liverpool, Catholics and Protestants at that time, they didn't really mix. And they certainly didn't support the same football teams, which was a very difficult issue. But it meant that they had already made a decision to break through convention. And although, when my family began, we started off in a very, very central area of Liverpool, Upper Parliament Street, which is the area of the immigrants. My grandfather, who was a sailor, used to say to me, never forget you're the last in. The first in were the Chinese, the second in were the African sailors, and the third in were the Irish. But because my father took exams after in the civil service, education again, studied at home, we eventually were a family that started on a social mobility trail, moving up the system, moving up the class system. And my absolute memory of about, I think I must have been 7 or 8, we moved from Upper Parliament Street, that was a very mixed community, to Chilwell Road, which was a white community. There were Jewish people there, but of course they were white. Other than that, so we were all white. And for the first time, I thought, this can't be right. Why didn't any of these other people come with me? And it was the first inkling I had, which was that education is a great route out, but there are other barriers than that. Gender being one, race being another, etc., etc. And I remember starting off my sort of the passion I've always had to tell stories, because I'm basically a theatre director. The passion I had to tell stories, putting on plays in the back garden, insisting that all the neighbours' children got involved, insisting that all the neighbours came to see them. I was probably charging them as well, but basically feeling that the one thing we had to do was somehow pull the community back together again, and the stories needed to be, you know, about us somehow. So I'm just saying that because we are often, we are very much the product of the values that we get, either from our parents, our neighbours, our circumstances, including the barriers that we notice when we're little. And then if somebody says to you, well, that's a barrier, but you could leap it, then it actually is quite an adventure. It's an adventure to think about how much further you can go. Before I went to drama at Birmingham University, I went through an extremely difficult teenage patch, which lots of children do. Many, many roads are taken by young people when they're searching for identity, when they're searching for kicks, you know, excitement, if they're stultified by things, if they're bored. And the rescue for me, to my teachers, was my head teacher saying to me, you know, you're either going to have a complete car crash or something positive can happen. I tell you what, why don't you just take the school hall every day at lunchtime and start your own theatre company? Because I was so, you know, over-imaginative and over-energetic, which I did. He also said to me, I think your problem is you're an existentialist. I was so flattered. I had no idea what the word meant. I thought, oh, I'm not a criminal, I'm an existentialist. And really from that point on, I began to realise that the things that I believed in and the energy that I have, which is, you know, genetic probably, if you can apply it not just to your own story, but to this idea of how do you realise your potential. The more you can realise your potential, the greater opportunity you have to help other people realise theirs.
But what's the key to realising that potential, and what's the key to turning a bad story around? Is it the influence of an individual, in this case a head teacher for you, or was it something internally?
Well, I think it's much more external in terms of when you're a young person and you're looking for role models and you're looking for endorsement. I think, endorsement from people who say to you, do you know what, we believe in you for the things that are great about you. It's very confusing I think it's very confusing for boys and girls, but particularly for girls, to have something which looks ambitious, which looks striving. I think girls are nervous of looking, that they're not sort of docile, that they're not nice, that they're not well-behaved. All of these sorts of things. It's a huge dilemma in lots of girls, I think. And I wasn't well-behaved, and I wasn't docile, and I was striving, which also makes you look precocious. So they're all very negative words that get used about girls at an early age. And I needed to be helped to understand that those negative words didn't mean that I had to behave negatively. That actually they were negative words put on a girl, which if you reinterpret those words and say, no, you're not precocious, actually you're excited about, the future, and you want to get there quickly. Ambition is not a negative thing. You want the best for yourself. And, the key Nelson Mandela quote, which is that the greatest fear that people have is that the possibility they could be great. So when I became the director of Soul and People's Theatre when I was 22, which was a community company touring youth clubs and pubs and special needs schools and so on, when I could combine this storytelling thing that happened to me when I was 8 with my love of theatre and put them together as an act of sort of social communication that I felt I was doing for other people as well as myself, then I kind of knew who I was. And that's sort of what I've been doing ever since in different ways. And for me, this twinning of how do you realise your potential, but recognise the fact that you live in a community, you live in a society, you are indebted to that society. If you've been able to realise your potential, you are in debt to the people who helped you do it. And then you just have to start giving back. And I'm constantly trying to encourage women not to fear being influential, not to fear striving to be who they could be, because there is this illusion that somehow that's like being very egotistical, whereas in actual fact it's taking the rightful position that you are capable of having. It doesn't mean you're blocking the light out on somebody else. It doesn't mean that you're standing in their space. It means that you're standing in the space that you could have always stood in. And
do you think that partly is a cultural thing, though? It's a very British thing to have reserve and perhaps not to be seen as boastful?
No, I think it's endemic to girls and women. The idea that actually the best kind of female is demure, silent, stepped back slightly, supporting from behind. That's really endemic in cultures right across the world. And I think that it means that women and girls have not been able to contribute as much as they could do yet. They've contributed as much as they possibly could in the context in which that they've been allowed to contribute, which is why we can see how marvellous they are. But I think there's an awful long way to go to get rid of that idea that somehow you as a woman do not have the right to claim the central space.
You spoke of the sort of demure archetypal woman, and that's the ideal that many women strive for. How do you rail against that? How do we break that down so that women actually see their role wherever it might be and don't feel constrained by these stereotypes?
Well, I mean, the first thing I want to say is that my description of myself is not a description of what I think women should be like in terms of their personality. There are probably 50 or 60 women here, and you'll all have different personalities, and some of your method of expressing yourself will be to be very reserved, very contained. There isn't a right way of being a woman, but there is a right way of being yourself. To try to make women more like each other that's a restriction for a start. And in terms of me, I also feel that I'm trying to, dissolve the idea as well that being a strong woman equals being an aggressive woman. I think aggression in women really comes much more from frustration or anxiety or insecurity. But most people, when they feel that they are able to be who they are, actually it's quite you feel light, not heavy, and you feel easy, not anxious. So I don't think there is a right way of being a woman. I mean, I like men a lot. I've got a son. I've got an ex-husband and a current boyfriend. I love my father, as you've heard me talk about him a great deal. I really like men. So I don't feel as if the issues about women's potential all lie with pushing men out of the sun. I think it's really about certainly helping people who are taking up all the room know that if they budged over, they'd have a better time themselves. That's certainly true. But it's also about saying, look, the space is there. Why aren't you moving into it? And I do think that I think self-censoring is probably where I would finally land.
And fear, possibly?
Yeah, I think women are... We're all fearful, but I think women fear... They fear looking... That phrase, who do you think you are? I think they fear looking like they thought they were too big for their boots. They fear being judged, and of course they are heavily judged, so they have some right to fear. But you've only got one go at your life, and you can't finally live it by what you think people might think about you.
What would you say to your 13-year-old self? What advice would you give your 13-year-old self? For those of us with teenagers, very keen to hear.
Well, that who I was a good thing to be.
So tell us a bit about your involvement with Plan and what drove you to get involved and how you see your future work.
When the UN announced Day of the Girl, Plan UK, and Janet particularly, who I've known for years as an activist, came and said, with the fact that Southbank Centre has been so clear about wanting to support girls and women's agendas, could we work together? So we cooked up this plan, didn't we, which was really very successful, that we would do Day of the Girl, we would take over the London Eye, we'd do the speed mentoring, which we'd created in WOW, on the pods, which was a big adventure for everybody, as it was just a way that, celebrities could have such a great time mentoring these young women, and all in a pod, going over London. So symbolically, it looked good too. It felt great. And the idea of making sure that girls and women in this country feel linked umbilically to the struggles and successes of girls and women around the world, for me this is a key thing. We cannot live in a bubble called wherever we're up to in the UK is fine or not. We can't live in that bubble. And if you have so much fiscal connection through global networks and economies, and you have so much communication network through the internet, we have to have a sort of moral interconnectivity as well. We do belong to each other as a species. We've got to think about the girls in Pakistan or Malawi or whatever.
Thank you all very much for attending, and Jude, thank you very much for being, as we had our contributor there saying, being so authentic and so real. Thank you very much for being so honest and sharing.
Bye.